Okay, so afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this School of Public Health Family Medicine noon meeting. My name's Lucy Gilson. I'm the head of the Health Policy and Systems Division, and we were responsible for today's session. And I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Nina Abrahams, who's a MPH graduate and a graduate of the Health Systems track specifically. And I know there are some other health systems tracks colleagues on the call. So it's great to be able to welcome Nina to talk with us today. Nina's currently a PhD candidate in a combined position between UCT and the University of Bristol. And she's going to talk today partly about her PhD research, but with a focus on the methodology of a social network analysis. And then also she's going to talk to us a little bit about her part-time job, it turns out, using Sensemaker. And both of these elements are going to be addressed under the overall umbrella heading of researching health and complexity. So as ever, Nina's going to do a presentation and then we'll open it up for questions and further experience. And I know Nina's keen to engage with people with other experience on the same areas rather than seeing it exclusively as a question and answer. But our intent today is really to think about methodologies for investigating health and complexity. So Nina, thank you so much for being with us and welcome. And over to you, my dear.
Thank you so much. And yeah, thank you for welcoming me back into the health department and for sort of sharing, as I said, as Lucy was saying, I've started my PhD since at the University of Bristol and University of Cape Town. And while I was in the UK at Bristol, I luckily got an opportunity to work part-time for the Cynefin Centre, which I'll speak about. I'm going to try and do both. And I sort of think of them, there's obviously overlaps, which I'll touch on at the end, but because I'm trying to do sort of both things, the PhD and the part-time work, I'm probably not going to do either of them much justice. So I really welcome afterwards if you want to connect with me or ask me questions at the end, or yeah, just understanding that this is going to be a very sort of like quick run through for what I've been up to. So just going to get my screen going. All right, and I hope you can all see that.
Good.
So I'm going to start with first going through my PhD research, which focuses on social network analysis. And then I'm going to think about the Cynefin Centre and the Sensemaker. And so they're two sort of different tools looking at health and complexity and looking and researching complexity in health, and then sort of think of them together. So starting with the PhD side of it. My PhD title is The Role of Social Network Research in Scaling Up and Sustaining Community-Based Health Programs in Low and Middle Income Countries. So sort of unpacking that, I'm not going to go into the background of the rates of non-communicable diseases. I think this audience is very aware of the high prevalence and the need to sort of do something about that to prevent and reduce non-communicable diseases. So this PhD is really framed around community-based programs as a WHO, World Health Organization Best Buy option. And as we sort of looking at community-based programs, there isn't much, sorry, just looking at the chat, there isn't much huge, strong evidence that community-based programs necessarily work. Some research say it does, some doesn't. The kind of part of it is that they're very broadly defined and their activities are very broad, but the idea is that community-based programs find a community, whether it's geographical or types of people, and they give a wide-reaching intervention across those people so that there might be a small effect on any individual, but it has a wide-reaching effect across a lot of people, sort of creates that wide population effect. So it's not a sort of a healthcare intervention, it's not a pharmaceutical intervention, it's usually wide-reaching activities and media and things that reach a lot of people. And so the idea is that it needs to be, at least in order for it to potentially work and be effective, it needs to reach a fair amount of people in a sustainable way. So what we wanted to do is understand how can we look at community-based programs and how can we understand that process of reaching a lot of people and being scalable and sustainable, so that we can understand the effectiveness of these types of programs, and can they be useful for preventing and reducing non-communicable diseases. We decided just to keep the sort of focus. We're looking at physical activity and healthy diet, community-based programs specifically, and also focusing on low and middle income countries. And one is to keep the scope reasonable and manageable, but also largely my case study that I'm kind of using to investigate this scaling up and sustaining of community programs is a physical activity and diet health program in low and middle in South Africa. Change my slide.
Nina, just forgive me. Leslie, Virginia, could I ask you to mute, because there's some background noise and you're unmuted. Thank you very much. Sorry, Nina, carry on.
So just to give some framing, the case study is called the Western Cape on Wellness, and it's a health department, government-run healthy lifestyle initiative. And so they look at lots of parts of wellness, which are physical activity and diet is sort of their main focus, but they look at financial wealth and spiritual wealth and all these kind of wellness as a spectrum. And they do a range of activities. Obviously, part of it was getting together and doing physical activity, which has been a bit difficult during COVID, but community gardening projects, nutrition talks, youth programs, and so on. So it's quite a broad program. And the idea is that the WOW team, as it's called, sits in the Department of Health, and then they have different partner organizations that support them in creating events, and then they train champions in different communities who then run their own community health groups with the support of the partners and the WOW team. So I'm using this case study to investigate the scaling up and sustaining of community-based health programs. The research is framed in a system science way, which I'm going to touch on later, but just basically understand the complexity of what's going on, and understanding that there's different parts of a system that might affect other parts, and you can't really predict how things are going to work in different places. It's a form of practice-based evidence. So what's happening in the real world, and how can we sort of understand that and unpack it? And yeah, trying to accept the sort of complexity of what's going on. So there's different ways of investigating in systems science, but sort of like natural experiments and so on. But I'm focusing on social network analysis as a form of system science. And social network analysis is really just trying to sort of quantify and make sense of the relationships within a system structure. So this is not an example from my research. I've just sort of taken it randomly. The idea is to get these kind of visual pictures and some statistical analysis of the relationships. Who knows who, and who are these types? What are the attributes of the people? So for example, here you can see there's different clusters perhaps between the purple and the green, and what are the different relationships and so on. So you're trying to kind of quantify and visualize the relationships within a system a defined system that you've decided. So generally the aim is to understand, is social network research useful at all in understanding the scaling up and sustaining of community-based programs? And if we can see, theoretically, there should be some use. If we can see some use, how can we use it to best support the scaling up and sustaining of complex community-based programs? In Bristol, the PhDs tend to be set out as 3 distinct studies that make up the full PhD. So that's sort of how I've set out my research. So it's made up of a feasibility study, which I'm not going to touch on. It was just, can this sort of social network research even be possible in a few interviews? Then a scoping review and a social network survey, which I did, and then some interviews, which I am about to start doing. So just to briefly go through the scoping review, was trying to look at, is there research on social network analysis in low and income countries to scale up and sustain community-based programs? We didn't find that much. We found about 12 studies, Only 3 of them looked at social network analysis as a discipline. Others just spoke about social networks and relationships and so on. And yeah, we did, really the scoping review helped to kind of solidify that there isn't evidence to back up that the theoretical possibilities that social network analysis potentially can offer. We did draw out 5 themes, so around centralization, shared goals, leadership, 5 sort of network themes that we could use that might help in this kind of research. So the social network survey was done with the WOW team. And what we did is we surveyed the WOW partners and to try and understand who they connected with and what are their attributes and what sense can we make of those structures. So we framed the questions based on the 5 themes that we found in the scoping review, things around identifying the centralization of the network, what their shared goals are, leadership, and so on. So we used those 5 themes. We did not get the highest response rate that there could ever be. There was about 39% of the partners responded. Because depending on how you frame your social network analysis survey, you can ask questions in an undirected way. So we asked, who are you connected with? And if they nominate someone else in the network, even if that person does not respond, we know some network information about them. We know that they're connected to the person who did respond. So you sort of, if it's undirected, you get a bit more network information than the people who have actually responded to the survey. And then we also have attribute data for more people than responded because the WOW team provided, the geographical location and the sort of sector that each partner is in. So it is a low response rate, but you can build up some of that data in other ways. And then we found some findings I'm going to show you in a second, but a few things came out that sparked questions, but it's difficult to say what that would mean without the context. As someone who's not part of the WOW program, I can't, if I get, say, a density score of the WOW network, that doesn't really mean, how connected different actors are. That relies on the context. Is that a good high connection? Do we want a high connection? Do we want a low connection? It's social network analysis is interesting on the data you can get from it, but you really need the context to make any kind of value judgments about what it means. So just to give you an example, so I used UCNet, which is a network analysis tool. There are some others, but UCNet is the most sort of, in terms of the academic sphere, is the most used to get the kind of visual outputs of the WOW network and a few statistical numbers, but I'm hesitant to be sort of overanalyze the statistics just because of the low response rate. I don't want to sort of make these claims about the network is this way, but I don't have enough of a response rate to sort of make those claims. But just to give an example of a network output, visual output. So this is from the data I have, the network of WOW, which doesn't really mean much. It doesn't tell you all that much. It's just, a lot of people are connected. And you can sort of play around with the analysis tool. So you can resize based on different attributes. So this is resized based on how many ties each actor has. So you can start getting a little bit of sense and zooming in like, okay, who have different ties. You can resize based on between the centrality. So who you need to go through to reach anyone else in the network. And now we get a very sort of clear picture like, okay, this is a very central network, and we can start asking questions about that. You can recolor. So the sort of blocks are called nodes, and they each represent an organization or an actor. And the lines, I should have said, are the who's connected to who. So you can color code. So these are color coded depending on who was nominated as a leader. We can start thinking of questions, in terms of having the sort of number of connections versus who's a leader, and you can start thinking about that. And you can really take it to its extreme in terms of visualization. So there's a statistical way to cluster them, or you can cluster them as you need to, color them, resize them, change the shape. So this is taking it to quite extreme. I'm not sure how much I'm going to use this, but for example, clustering them in the sector that they're from, resizing based on how many connections they have, reshaping them depending on, I think it was financial contribution, color coding them and geography, and you can just start gaining a little picture depending on how you want to manipulate and understand and see your visual output of social network analysis. So as I said, seeing that visualization and seeing the data and going, the density of this network is this, and there's so many, it needs the context, it needs people to say what that means, which is not inherent in social network analysis. I'm doing a mixed methods investigation, so I'm adding the sort of interview phase, and social network analysis as itself doesn't necessarily lead to sort of the contextualization of it. So the final step in the PhD, which I've just got a few interviews scheduled now, which will be coming up, is to sense check and understand, we've got this network information. Does it make sense? Are things missing? Do you disagree? It was a low response rate, so it could absolutely be not correct in certain ways. What would you do with this information? Is it useful to know this information? So that will be the next step in the PhD. And then just to throw it in, following along all this, I'm doing these different studies. I'm trying to draw out some theory that might be useful for people looking at, scale income and sustaining community-based health programs in low and middle income countries. So this is a work in progress, and I'm not too sure how I'm going to eventually show it and visualize it, but it's just a sort of drawing out network context and scale up and sustainability and mechanism themes, so sort of a little cog, what networks and what context with which mechanisms lead to scale up and sustainability, and just trying to draw out some variables there, which I will work through, and that will be part of the PhD. So I've zoomed through that, and definitely social network analysis as a tool. I've absolutely I've done a very fast run through. I'm then going to talk about Sensemaker and then a little bit about how they're thinking about them together. But are there any burning questions about the PhD side now before I kind of change track into the Sensemaker?
So Nina, maybe it's just worth clarifying before you move on, the reason for looking at social network analysis. What's the question you're hoping to ask specifically using the social network analysis about the WOW program?
I think it's really to try and understand the social network analysis as a tool has said it's going to be so useful, and it can do all these things, and you can look at it and decide that you need to change the network in these ways, and then you'll have a stronger network, really, and that will be able to sort of sustain. And I guess the WOW program is being used as a little guinea pig, I guess, to explore, can it do that? When you look at the social networks, is it useful? So there's a little two-part in the WOW network, because I'm for them and for that benefit. I'm trying to understand what is the network structure, what kind of stats can we get from it, and then also, is this a useful process? Does it mean anything, and how can we improve that? If it is useful, how can we improve that process? So they're kind of sort of a two-step in terms of the WOW involvement.
So Steve Reed is putting a comment in the chat box. Maybe there's something you just want to pick up. He says, I understood the value of SNA is in showing changes in response to interventions. So you would need repeated snapshots of the networks. Do you want to comment on that?
I will comment on it at the end. It will come up at the end as well.
Okay, great. All right. So we aren't finished discussing SNA, but maybe you'd like to move on to Sensemaker, and people keep thinking about your questions and comments. Thanks, Nina.
Yeah, so please, I'll sort of loop back at the end, but please keep this in mind. I've presented it separately just because I tend to work with them separately in terms of PhD and part-time work, but they kind of come together as well. So social network aside for a moment and the PhD aside for a moment, on the other days of my week, I work for the Cynefin company. It used to be called Cognitive Edge, founded in about 20 years ago by Dave Snowden. It's sometimes a familiar name to people. And slides again. So the idea around Cynefin company is that it's a sort of action-based research. It provides action-based research tools and methods and theory to work through complexity of different spheres of life. And the sort of tenet being that things are complex and we can't see it all and we don't know it all, and we can't predict and we can't force people to fill a goal that we then miss a whole lot of other goals that we weren't even aware of. And so really what we want to do is understand what is going on in the here and now, and how can we make sense of that so that we can then act in it. And just to clarify, when it says Cynefin company, Cynefin Centres falls within the Cynefin company and looks, there's sort of different programs. So there's an education program, a climate change program, a citizen engagement program, and so on. Generally working with NGOs and academics and government entities. So the Cynefin Centre falls under that, and I work in the health program part of it. So Cynefin company has a variety of tools and theories that it uses. Some I work with more than others, and really, yeah, in terms of the tools come from a theoretical basis. So Cynefin framework, complex adaptive systems, narrative anthropocomplexity. These are all words that kind of get thrown about, and from that, different tools to work through complexity. So different kinds of complex facilitation, future backward, ritual descent, hexakits. These are just different ways that or different tools that the Cynefin company offers to work through complexity. And you can find them all on there's a sort of open source Wikipedia hub that you can go and you can work through all of those. And often we work with them together. It depends what people really need. Do they need in-person workshops? Do they need a longer term investigation and so on? So there's different complexity tools that Cynefin company offers. I'm going to focus on one today, which is the Sensemaker, which is probably what Cynefin company is most known for. And I have this slide, but I think it's actually easier to, I'm going to show you a Sensemaker sort of example, and then we can sort of walk through that. And I think, look at the time, I think that will be easier, and I'll touch on things that are on the slide here. So I'm just going to stop sharing for a second and hopefully you can find where I'm going. All right, I'm hoping you can see the new slide, Diabetes and Me.
Yeah.
So thank you. So this is just, I've just taken one at random. It's a pilot Sensemaker, so it's a bit longer than we normally do, but this was a network in Wales that is NHS network that is trying to support children and young people with type 1 diabetes, as well as their families. So there's a Sensemaker for the children and there's a Sensemaker for their families, and eventually I think there'll be one for health professionals to get a sense of what is going on with children and young people. It's a complex situation. They can't predict how can they best support children and young people when they don't really know. There's things going on in their life, there's things going on in terms of accessing healthcare, and they don't want to assume what's going on. So the aim of sort of Sensemaker is to get overall patterns about the things that people choose to share about, rather than trying to assume or ask specific questions that the researchers have decided are important to ask. And the idea is to get the qualitative stories, and then people self-theme their own stories. So it gets the qualitative and quantitative side, rather than a whole lot of qualitative that people then decide what the themes are, and rather than just quantitative where there's no sort of context and a bit of a richer story. The Sensemaker really tries to combine those two. So typically what you might see is a kind of landing page, which you can change the logo, background, and intro text, just saying this is a Sensemaker, generally a sort of informed consent introduction page, as you normally see. Then how it normally starts is with a story prompt. And so this is sort of trying to get at a micro narrative, or a sort of water cooler, as we call it, conversation, the kind of things that come out that people experience. So it's not an evaluate, it's not saying, I think this needs to happen in this department. It's saying, yesterday, I spoke to someone in the department and this happened, and it's a sort of experiential, descriptive story of something they've experienced to do with what we're investigating. So we do give a little bit of constraint. It's not tell me any story in your life ever. It's for this one, it's tell something that's happened to them with their diabetes that's changed things for them. So the framing is thinking of a changing moment. Perhaps you want to hear it, or they can choose to share a story with someone that, if someone is newly diagnosed, what kind of story would they share that kind of resembles or represents their experience, or is highlighted in their mind, or maybe you say share a story that happened last week, if this is going to be a continuous thing to be captured, or there's a little bit of constraint, but really it's opening it up for them to say a story that interests, well, that's highlighted for them, and it really kind of opens that up. And usually you say, it can be positive, negative, neutral, whatever it is, it's a story that's important to the person. And you can also audio capture stories. We then tend to ask for a story or a title or some kind of hashtag. And this is quite sort of how a qualitative investigator might give themed words to a qualitative piece or a transcript. People decide on their own themes and the things that are highlighted to them, their own keywords or title. And this is can be quite useful in the sort of word cloud to see what type of stories are coming up. Then people theme their stories in different ways. So all the signifiers, which we call them, link back to the story that they've given. So the first one, is just a little example, but is called a triad, or it looks like a triangle. And the idea is that it has 3 points that are equally possible. So they cannot be all positive, all negative, all neutral, but they all have to be possible within the relation to the story. So they tend to be a little bit broader and abstract, so that they could all, so that they sort of open it up to a person identifying in some way if they're abstract enough. So for example, who did they interact with? So they could have interacted with others with type 1 diabetes. In their story, they could have interacted with healthcare professionals, family with friends, and they would put their little dot there, or they could have interacted with all 3, or just 2 of those. So you move your little button around to indicate where on this where on the 3 points that you lie. So it's trying to get at the sort of tension and balance between 3 equally possible points. And the idea is that having 3 makes you stop a little bit. It's a little bit more of a cognitive load, and so you do kind of stop and have to think in terms of balancing those equally viable options. And so where was their attention, and so on. So you can ask, what confident in my healthcare team, my future. So these triads tend to be built up either by literature reviews and policy, or by the people who are going to answer the survey, and we do workshops to get at the sort of concepts that are important. So just in terms of time, I'm going to leave it there for. So these are triads, and there's quite a few here just because it's a pilot, but in terms of that. The next one is a dyad. So it's a sort of sliding scale. So rather than negative to positive, we kind of keep the hypothesis or what we expect somewhere in the middle, and then we try and take it to its two extremes on either side. So here we expect people in their story maybe are independent, but also supported in some way, but maybe they had to do absolutely everything for themselves, or other people did everything for them. And we kind of get that. If we take an hypothesis to its extremes, where do people lie? And you can get a sort of histogram output of that, and people signify. So that's the other type. There's also a stone signifier, which I'm not going to, there isn't one here, and it's sort of on either just an x-axis or an xy axis, and you put sort of dots of representing people or ideas in relation to each other. So that's another type of signifier. Then a SenseMaker always has multiple choice questions about the story. So for example, this one asks where your story takes place. How positive, we don't want to assume that a story is positive or negative for a person. They sort of self-identify what that is. And then we also ask multiple choice questions about who they are, sort of demographics, age, whatever is important, age, gender, whatever demographics are important. And the multiple choice questions are useful to then filter the stories and the signifiers and the themes that you get. So perhaps you want to know, you've got the stories and themes, but you want to see only the positive stories and get a sense of that, or only the negative stories, or what different males and females are sort of theming their stories differently, or what types of stories. So we use the filters, the multiple choice questions, to filter those stories and those themes. And then lastly, we tend to, because the story is just a micro narrative, we understand that there's probably some other questions you might want to also ask the audience. And then there's open-ended questions at the end that you can put all of that. So just to go back to my... So yeah, the understanding is that you get these stories and that people then theme their own stories. You join in the qualitative and the quantitative. And because you can get that quantitative data quite quickly to draw those patterns, you can access that data as it's rolling in, and you can sort of, it's like theming your qualitative data in real time. So you can see things as they're going, and you can make changes, and anyone can access that data if you give permission to access in real time, and you can sort of start making judgments. And what we tend to do with this is to go, we want more stories like this and less like that. And so we look at positive stories, and rather than trying to change people and systems, we go, what small changes can we make to get these more positive stories to happen? And what small changes can we make to reduce the kinds of negative stories that are coming out? And also when you're looking at the themes, what are we seeing a lot of? What are we seeing a little bit, but we need to be worried that there might be more, and so on. And I'll show you, for example, this is a way of doing it in a heat map, but getting an output that shows what I don't know what the SenseMaker was about, but seeing that teachers and students on a question of how they best learn had different ways that they would actually theme their stories. And it can be quite useful to even use the findings in a workshop and sort of for people to kind of take that bird's eye view and realize that there's different views, that people have different views than themselves. Another one, if you're doing a continuous capture, you can look over the different months if you're asking the same question. And each little dot here represents a story, so you can sort of highlight in if you just want to read the stories that are all under the feeling safe theme. and you can get a sense of where the sort of stories are busy lying in those different themes. So that was, let me look at the time. So that was Sensemaker, which is one tool of Connect & Company, and we tend to use it with other workshop tools and other ways. Some people want to continuously capture, some people want one Sensemaker, whatever it is, but it's one of the main tools that we use in the Connect & Company. So just, I think I have some more time. This is kind of just me throwing out different thoughts, and it would be nice to open up discussion and hear your thoughts. So just in terms of that question that got asked earlier in terms of continuous capture, absolutely, both of these tools, social network analysis and Sensemaker, what can be really useful about them and what they really try to do is working in that complexity. And they're not trying to get one answer. They realize that there's so much going on. It's not about getting one answer, but it's getting a sense of what is going on at the time, and it can be quite useful to have that bird's eye structure or pattern view for people to kind of step out of their own zone and look a bit further and go, this is what's going on, this is what other people are thinking. I had no idea other people thought this, or I had no idea these relationships were there. And so it's quite nice to get that bird's eye view. But absolutely, the relationships and the stories are going to change potentially very rapidly. And so it's quite important in any complexity research to keep that kind of research alive and to keep it moving and to keep understanding what's going on. So actually a criticism of system science for the social network analysis is that it tends to, and this is a bit in evaluation as well, is it tends to go, this is our desired goal, how can we kind of get people there? Working backwards, how can we get people to this desired goal? Where systems thinking tries to go, this is the description of what's going on now. What small little changes can we make? Then let's reassess the system. What small little changes can we make? And it's sort of moving in the right direction, but without choosing a goal that then makes you sort of blind to any other goals that could be out there and any other opportunities. It slowly tries to shift that system and get a description of what's going on so that you can make sense and act in that system. That's particularly why I've added the interview part of social network analysis, because I think that gives at least a little bit of context and how this is useful, and that bird's eye view, so that people can think about how it might be useful and what sorts of changes could be made. But there is still the sort of danger of going, the network needs to change in this kind of way, and then that will solve everything. So it's trying a little bit to keep out of that in complexity, making these kind of end goal statements. In terms of similarities, so narratives can open you up to a lot of possibilities. It might not be what you want to hear. It also might not be what you're able to act in. And people then share their stories with you, but it's like beyond your scope potentially. So it's important to sort of keep that in mind if you're doing a Sensemaker. Social network analysis focuses a bit more on the sort of that relationship aspect and one aspect of network structure. And then there's ethical concerns in that as well, in terms of, do you name people when you show the network? How are people going to feel when they see the network? And how are seeing the network going to influence the network? So yeah, there's definitely sort of ethical concerns in both of them to consider. The structural, but we're saying again that I've added the mixed methods to social network analysis. That's not inherent, where Sensemaker tries to make it the same. In terms of, I've written there missing a little data, both of them take that bird's eye pattern view. And so if you don't have a fair amount of data, it's hard to get that overview picture. You do need to try and get a fair amount of data and a fair amount of people to engage, so that you can start seeing patterns of your system. Neither tool are going to solve data collection, buy-in and stakeholder engagement and calling people or sending a survey. They don't solve that for you. But the sort of visual nature and the slightly different nature of both of them and the pattern nature does, from my experience, show a little bit more engagement and interest once people get on board and can see those pictures and go, oh, I can see that where this is going. It tends to get easier and easier to get that engagement because people find it quite intuitive and they find it quite engaging and fun to look at and be kind of shocked when they see that people have different thoughts than them. So in that sense, they can be quite engaging, but they do need people to respond. And you do need to recognize that the picture can change. You do need to recognize that because they sort of are quite qualitative, or I suppose it's a thing in quantitative, the researchers and the people setting these things up are going to have a lot of influence, and it's about recognizing that and trying to engage as many people as possible in that research and developing the surveys and so on. Getting people involved in the data analysis is incredibly important. Probably incredibly important to get the audience that it serves and to get a lot of voices in the data analysis. But really, it's not about, for both of them, it's not about trying to get this perfect picture that's going to solve, it's going to be the answer. But it's really about understanding what's going on to get a springboard to make these next steps to hopefully move in a better and stronger direction for the sort of complexity that is health and that is life. So I think that is my time. I'm looking at that, so I'll end it there and then welcome questions now, as well as I'm going to put my email in the chat, but find me there or on LinkedIn, or I'll also put a link to a Sensemaker example that was used in another UCT department. I think they did it on water security, and they went out and did Sensemaker with community members who are water scarce. But please, questions, helping me. There are things that can help me in my research and my work and things that can help you. I look forward to engaging in that. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Nina. Very, very clear presentation of complex tools and methods to address complex issues. So we're going to welcome comments, questions, reflections, similar experiences. I'm just noting that Ntiki has made a comment in the chat about Sensemaker, interesting take on a narrative approach being transformative and empowering. Ntiki, I wonder if you'd like to add anything further as you made that comment. Is there anything you'd like to further engage over?
No, not really, Lucy. Thanks, Nina. But I mean, really, this talk is very interesting. I'm also impressed by those visual networks. But I think I'll contact Nina and engage her offline. Sure. But I mean, this is very interesting. I really love this transference of ownership, because we really can't make assumptions about people's experiences, but allowing them, to give a name to their experiences, to use their voices, to use their words. I mean, it really just opens up, so many channels, and I really like how empowering it is, to your participants.
Great, thanks.
Thank you.
Excellent. Lynn, I see your hand. If others want to make an input, please stick your hand up. Lynn, over to you.
Hi, Nina. Thanks so much for your talk. It was interesting to hear both about your PhD and your work. I have just a question about kind of the response rate and that kind of being a limitation around social network analysis. And I know because I'm thinking and looking into doing something similar, and I think that is one of the kind of limitations around it. So kind of two aspects of that, maybe just hearing your experience about how you did try to engage and increase the response rate, and then also kind of post data collection, if there are kind of ways. I think you mentioned the kind of removing the direction and even including people who didn't respond, but kind of ways to overcome that. Yeah,
I think it's very tricky, especially in network analysis, because if there's 100 people in your network and you get 99 response rate, but one person could have a whole lot of relationships that completely change the network picture. So low response rate is definitely an issue. I think a few things about that is to recognize the low response rate. So I'm not trying to overanalyze the networks that I have found. I did the feasibility study, helped me get buy-in so the WOW team was helping me collect a lot of their data, like sending out the surveys and sending reminders and so on. And so the feasibility study was really important to get them on board, to decide, should we call people? Can we email people? It was during COVID, so people actually weren't in the office, so they couldn't access the computer to get to the survey. So getting a lay of the general engagement things that would come up in any survey. And then I think the undirected, if you do a directed network, that's asking somebody's relationship to somebody else, but you can't assume that goes backwards. So do you trust that person? You can't assume trust goes both ways. And so you just have the data of the people who answered you. And the undirected, because I asked about collaboration, I did assume that if one person collaborated, the collaboration goes both ways. So that was what I was saying in terms of having more data compared to the people who answered my survey. And then, sorry, the last bit was why I think that mixed method interview part is so important, is that I'm taking an interview prompt with and visual and other analysis findings, but making it very clear, sort of at the beginning, middle, and during all of it going, this is incomplete. What would you add to this? What do you think about it? So I'm interviewing people who didn't necessarily answer the survey to give people a chance. And I suppose one of the things is that potentially I wouldn't get the most engagement, but I'd like to think with things like this, with Sensemaker and with social network analysis, if you're working, part of it is working again and again and getting that information. And then I think people, because they can see it and they can see themselves in the role they play, it just sort of, I see the engagement snowballs. So it's tricky for one-off, doesn't solve all the issues, but because it's meant to be a sort of continuous engagement, showing people what the findings, engaging, it's kind of snowballs from there.
Yeah, thanks, Nina. So it's like the visual image allows a continuing conversation, and the images themselves anyway need to be contextualized to be understood.
Yeah.
Thanks. Steve, welcome. Over to you, sir.
Thanks, Nina. Excellent presentation. We're introduced to social network analysis by Barbara Klugman, who some of you know, in the context of a fellowship program over a year, where one of the objectives was to increase the fellows' networks. So she measured beginning, middle, and end, and showed this quite significant expansion of the fellows' networks as a result, or during that year. Hence my comment in the chat. And it was a very powerful visual and quantitative kind of picture of the effect of the program. So I suppose I'm just emphasizing the longitudinal nature of the value of this. My question is about the slight disjuncture between that and what you presented in the SPHFM kind of triangles and dyads, which seem to depend on a number of assumptions that those 3 points are the right sort of points. Whereas, with qualitative research, tell me your story, anything can come out, and that often challenge our assumptions or surface things that we really didn't expect. Like people tell you the most extraordinary things, and you've got to say, whoa, okay, we need to take that into account. So I just didn't quite understand how those triangles and dyad things kind of fitted into the general approach of a sort of emergent picture.
Yeah, just on the first point, in terms of network analysis, I even asked, how many people do you collaborate with? And then how many people do you have a close collaboration with? And you see this wonderful network picture, and then suddenly the close one is much smaller. So sometimes even just seeing all these networks doesn't necessarily tell you who's connected and how much quality are behind. In terms of the SenseMaker, the setting out the signifiers does have that researcher influence in them, absolutely. So we tend to spend a fair amount of time at the beginning getting on board about what a SenseMaker is, and then in terms of trying to choose what concepts you land up putting on those signifiers. As I said, we take a range of influence. So it might be from the literature on a certain topic, influences what you want to look at on that signifier. Or we go to the source of the people who are going to be answering, and we do a workshopping there to understand what are the key core concepts coming out of that. And those go on these signifiers. And then we always do a piloting phase. Does this make sense to people? Are people confused by what it means? Are people not answering the thing, or not answering the tribe because they're not understanding it? So it takes some time to build that. And for example, we have a nursing one where they've done a phase of a year following every month. And now they've sat back and they're reviewing it and they're updating some of the signifiers and they're doing another review. I'm going to so Charmaine's got a hand up and she actually used SenseMaker in her PhD, and I'm wondering if she wants to jump in here at all.
Hi, thank you, Nina. I think that was a great presentation. I just want to say that I struggle, and I struggled throughout my PhD, and I still struggle to summarize what SenseMaker is, and I think you really did that incredibly well. So with the triads and the dyads, you basically use a theoretical construct to set them up, Steve. For instance, I use the Weick's theory of sense making to understand operational decision making in government emergency centers, and all of my triads built on different aspects of Weick's theory. So the questions are really based, it's constructed from theory, and then you can develop a new theory or conceptual framework. So it's quite important, or as Nina said, you can have the workshops prior, but it's quite important to make sure that those triads don't have kind of a right answer or a preferred answer. And same with the kind of the dyads or the polarities, it's really putting two things on separate poles, and your kind of, if you want to say right answer, but your most preferred answer is somewhere in the middle. It's not it's not a yes, no, where we want people to say yes. It's kind of like different spectrums. And then you throw all of this together, and the biggest thing that comes out of that is the patterns that you can find. So one or two people giving you a SenseMaker or completing a SenseMaker survey isn't going to be meaningful. Where it becomes meaningful is if you have 50 or 100 people and you can find the different patterns on the triads. And then what SenseMaker Analyst does is you can use the demographics as a filter. So in my study, I could see how nurses versus doctors are answering the same question. And that gives you the multiple perspectives that you can then kind of explore further. Thank you.
Thanks, Charmaine. That's helpful. Yeah. Great. And very interesting, Charmaine, to also hear about your SenseMaker work. Thank you. Would anybody else like to chip in at the moment? Any other thoughts? I want to comment that I like the idea, and I thought you explained it so well, Nina, that they are research tools that help us understand a state, if you like, but what they contribute to is the possibility of bringing about small change and then reflecting whether that small change is sort of achieving the sorts of directions, not goals, that you're hoping to achieve. And I think that idea that in researching complexity, we're also seeking to act in complexity, and that the repeated reflection on the state of the complex system allows us to see whether the sorts of changes that seem to be appropriate given the first assessment are coming through. And I thought that idea with the, the sort of allowing people to generate their own ideas of their experience, and then you build your change direction on that, is links back to Nsiki's comment about not predetermining things, but allowing change to emerge from a situation. So I thought that was also a very interesting insight about how these approaches can be used to nurture and encourage change.
In Carnarvon, we use different tools, but that we tend to refer to that as the vector theory of change. So sort of not theory of change was the end goal, but really theory of change of what's close by and how can you shift small things and then reassess. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I see that Charmaine's also popped a paper reference in the chat box for more information there. So for others who want to follow up. I'm just going to double check if anybody else would like to add thoughts at the moment. I think we're all very impressed, Nina, by how you made very clear some very complex concepts and ideas, but also I really like that box at the end of the reflections on the approaches. So it's absolutely great to have had you with us, Nina. Thank you so much for sharing.
Sort of feedback, as it were.
And as Nina said, she's keen to continue the conversation. She's popped her email in the chat box. And I know that you're currently in South Africa, but returning to Bristol later in the year to keep going with the PhD. So good luck with that. And we look forward to welcoming you back here again. So thanks to everybody for being on the call today. Thanks for the inputs and contributions. Nina, thank you again. And good luck with the PhD.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you, everybody. Goodbye today.